Hi everybody, we are back with a quick theory video about nut advantages and how they affect equity realization. So first things first, what is a nut advantage? Generally speaking, a nut advantage is when one player is significantly more likely to have the strongest possible hands, also known as the nuts, on a certain board. For example, on a board of 8-8-2 rainbow, a tight under the gun opener will have 71% raw equity against the wide big blind defend range you see on the right. However, they were never going to have trips or better if they're opening a really tight range that never has an 8 or never has deuce-deuce or never has pocket 8s, for example, whereas the wide big blind defender is going to have trips or better 9% of the time. So in this case, the under the gun opener has an equity advantage, but they do not have a nut advantage. The next concept is equity realization. So equity realization is a measure of how often you're actually able to get to showdown and capture the equity that your hand has versus your opponent. So for example, let's say you're on a board of 8, 9, 10 jack with 3 clubs. You have pocket 2s without a club. If villain makes a really large bet on the turn, you're forced to fold because your hand is really bad. But if it turns out that villain had ace king with ace of clubs, you actually folded a hand that had 58% equity. So in this case, by making a large bet, villain prevented you from realizing that equity. And if you always have pocket deuces in this spot and you always fold it to a turn bet, then even though you have 58% equity, that equity is worthless because you're never going to realize it and you're never going to get to showdown. So in poker, a lot of strategies are built around trying to realize equity with some of our hands and also preventing our opponent from realizing equity by making various bets of various sizes, and in many cases it will involve a nut advantage. To demonstrate the effect that a nut advantage has on equity realization, let's take a theoretical example on a flop of king, 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 where one player is either going to have the nuts or air, and the other player is going to have 2 bluff catchers. So in this situation, there are 10 chips in the pot, the effective stack is 250, and each player has the option of either betting half the pot or 1.5 times the pot. In position player has exactly 2 combinations, aces or 3 high, and player 2 is either going to have pocket 10s or pocket 9s. In this case, because the player 1 has 2 combos and player 2 has 2 combos, and because aces basically has the bluff catchers drawing dead, and the bluff catchers have 3 deuce offsuit drawing dead, each player has exactly 50% equity. If each player can see the other player's cards, then each player is going to realize their equity and capture about half of the pot on average. This is because player 2 is only going to put chips into the pot versus 3 high, and it's just going to fold when the other player has aces, and player 1 is just going to fold their 3 high when the other person has pocket 10s or pocket 9s. So in this case, they are going to, on average, win about half of the pot. However, in poker, you obviously can't see the other player's cards. So what happens in this situation with these ranges when you run it in Pio Solver? When you run it in Pio Solver, player 2 captures 0% of the pot in the long run. In fact, when you run it in Pio Solver, player 2 has to fold to any bet on the flop. So here's the Pio output. And you can see that the out of position player with their 2 bluff catchers is electing to check 100% of the time. And then the player with the polarized range, with the nut advantage, is electing to bet 25 times the pot sometimes. They're going to bet 1.5 times the pot sometimes. They're going to bet half the pot sometimes, and sometimes they're going to check. But what you can see is, even if they pick a half pot bet, the player with the 2 bluff catchers folds 100% of the time. So even versus the smallest bet, they're going to fold 100% of the time. And for that reason, they're never going to capture any of this pot. And that's because of the nut advantage and the high stack to pot ratio. But what happens when you swap the positions? As you may know, in general, when you're in position, you tend to realize equity significantly better than when you are out of position. And in our first example, the player with the nut advantage was in position. So if we flip the positions and we give the positional advantage to the player with 2 bluff catchers, what happens when you rerun the simulation? Well, even when you rerun the simulation with flipped positions, the player with the in-position advantage with their 2 bluff catchers is still going to have to fold to any bet on the flop just because player 1 can continue to apply pressure on the flop, turn, or river, and player 2 is drawing dead when player 1 has the nuts. So the takeaway for this video is that nut advantages are very significant to equity realization, and having a nut advantage can help you realize equity despite not necessarily having a raw equity advantage over your opponent in a certain situation. And in general, when you build a strategy on a flop, turn, or river, it should not just take into account whose range has more equity, but it should also take into account whose range has the nuts, and how should this affect how I play the rest of my range.